Good morning. My name is Hindell Grossman. I'm the host of Inside Divorce. I'm a divorce attorney, owner of the law firm Grossman and Associates in Newton, and I'm here today to talk with Marc Gudema of BayState Business Brokers. And we're going to be talking about making a business sellable, what makes it easy to sell a business, and what makes it hard to sell a business.
Because, you say at the beginning, let's say we have $1 million that we want to get for the business, and then somebody is out of the loop, and then 4 months later you say, well, we have a deal at $800,000, and of course you say, what do you mean at $800,000? What happened?
Yeah.
Or on the other direction, you have a deal at $1.5 million, and you say, oh, that's great, right? Well, the spouse could say, well, how do you know that's a good price? If you underestimated what the selling price is, how come I know? Maybe you should have got $2 million for it.
Sounds like you have a little experience with this.
Yes, a little bit.
Good morning, Marc.
Good morning, Hindell, and thank you for having me on your show.
My pleasure. I'm very excited to talk to you about your perspective on making a business as marketable as possible for sale. So how does divorce impact the likelihood of a business sale?
It depends on the owner and the spouse. If they are cooperative in terms of the divorce, then, and I don't, you would know better about that, whether it's an oxymoron, but it can affect the sales significantly or not have an impact. But I think that one thing that you have to do is become even more as a business broker selling a business on top of a few things. One is right up front having the owner and the spouse be on the same page in terms of the expectations. Yeah. Have them actually sign, not just say, oh yes, I agree with that price, but have them sign the listing agreement that says we're going to try and get $1 million for this business. Yeah. So that's number one, so that they've written that they've agreed to sell it for a certain price. And another thing is really to keep everybody in the loop in terms of communication. Because, you say at the beginning, let's say we have $1 million that we want to get for the business, and then somebody is out of the loop, and then 4 months later you say, well, we have a deal at $800,000, and of course you say, what do you mean at $800,000? What happened?
Yeah. Or
on the other direction, you have a deal at $1.5 million, and you say, oh, that's great, right? Well, the spouse could say, well, how do you know that's a good price? If you underestimated what the selling price is, how come I know? Maybe you should have got $2 million for it.
Sounds like you have a little experience with this.
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah.
And not just with the divorcing people, but other people who aren't divorcing. Right, right.
Yeah.
Some of the same issues come up. But
yeah. Well, yeah, you're in a way, if you are representing a business owned by, one spouse that's in the middle of a divorce or in the process of a divorce, you have two kind of potential clients, both the business owner and the spouse, because a business is a marital asset.
Yes. So you just have to be much more aware of the spouse and the spouse's concerns and make sure, because we're always looking, obviously a business broker is getting paid primarily on commission. So we're looking not just at what the size of that commission might be, but how likely is it? And when you have people who are divorcing, it makes it a little less likely because of this conflict. What if they get back together and just decide we're not going to sell the business, right? That's possible, isn't it?
Tell you, I don't see that happen very often, but it's certainly possible.
Okay. We haven't had it happen either, but we always thought that's a possibility.
I'm always happy when that happens.
Yes.
It doesn't happen often enough, unfortunately. So to distinguish this podcast from another podcast that we recorded recently on valuing businesses for the purpose of divorce, the way that you look at businesses is different than the way Heather Tuller talked about valuing businesses for divorce on a previous podcast. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I know I listened to her podcast, and of course, business valuation people, she talked about the three approaches, the asset approach, the income approach, and the market approach, and she talked about how the valuation people use the income approach a lot, and we end up using the market approach a lot because we're talking with people about selling their businesses, and so we're very much interested in what those businesses sell for. So that's one difference. Another difference is that people who do business valuations can only look at and take into account the numbers from the business and the other information from the business being sold. Whereas we're trying to find what are called strategic buyers who are willing to pay more than that because they have a reason for valuing it more. They have some assets themselves. They may have a much larger sales force, or they may want to get into the market that the seller is in and be willing to pay more than what the financial value of the business is.
Before we get into today's theme, which is maximizing a sale of a business and identifying the things that make it harder to sell a business, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your business?
Well, BayState Business Brokers, I started about 12 years ago. And before that, I had owned a couple businesses myself, and also many years ago earned an MBA, but then owned two significant businesses. One was an auto body supply business that I built up and then sold to a public company that was buying up those businesses. And then for several years, I owned a printing business that was primarily a trade printer. And so we sold primarily to other printers. And since becoming a business broker 12 years ago, I've sold a number of those businesses, former clients, which I get a kick out of.
You mean in the automotive industry and the printing industry?
Exactly, okay. Yes. And we have an office in Needham. I have a partner, Sarah Grossman. And
no relation to me, right?
No relation to you, but a relation to me. She's
Yes.
my daughter.
Okay.
Great broker. She's been with the company for 8 years.
Yes. So it's family business. I like that.
Family business, yes.
I like that. And you, as a business broker, do you work primarily on the seller side or the buyer side, or does it matter?
We work primarily on the seller side. We've done some buyer representation, but we really, and I should say, on the buyer side, yes, we work with buyers who come to us and say, I'm looking for a business to buy, and we'll show them the businesses that we have available, as well as I started a co-broke group several years ago, and so we can show them those businesses also. But we don't do what's called a targeted search. If somebody came to us and said, I want to buy a landscaping business, and I want you to go out and contact all the landscaping companies and see who wants to sell, and work with me, and I'll pay you to do that, we'll send them to somebody else typically, because that's not what we're spending our time doing. We're really spending our time selling businesses and working with sellers.
All right. So if today's theme is maximizing a business for sale, what do you recommend to your sellers how to maximize their business, and when do you start the conversation?
Well, we start the conversation as early as the sellers want to, and really there are people who come to us and say, I'm thinking of selling in the next 5 or 10 years. I'd like you to give me an estimate of what my business would sell for now, and then what can I do to make it worth more? And if they really want to go through the whole process, they should also include a financial planner who will then take those numbers and what other assets they have and see how much money they would have when they want to retire. But some of the things that we recommend, for example, and look at, one is very stable, growing revenues and earnings. And when we look at that, we're looking at a concept called SDE, or seller's discretionary earnings. Many of the businesses that we sell are sold to individuals, and those individuals are looking at all the income and benefits to a working owner because they're going to replace the owner of the business. And as you know, in a successful business, many times the owner is taking out legitimate perks out of the business. They may have a company car, they might have other benefits, paying for their retirement plan out of the business, and other benefits like that. And so that's included in what we call seller's discretionary earnings on top of the profits of the business, the salary of the owner. And it's also used by lenders to evaluate the business, perfectly legitimate. Lenders do like to see that there's some profit in the business. So it's a bad idea to write off all these things and come out with losses every year. That doesn't look good to a lender. Also, declining sales and earnings are a red flag too. That, with lenders, can make it difficult to get a loan, for a third-party lender to loan on the business. And a lot of the businesses that we sell are financed through SBA loans.
I see. So declining sales, over how long a period of time would you consider a declining sale an obstacle to getting financing?
Over the last 3 years.
3 years. So a 2-year decline, but then a 1-year profit wouldn't be as concerning to a lender.
Perhaps not. They would ask for an explanation. Right. It's stability in the earning. The greatest thing is, if sales and earnings are going up 5 or 10% every year, that looks terrific.
Yeah, growth is really appealing to lenders, and profitability.
And profitability,
I
cash
imagine.
flow.
Yeah.
Yes.
And heading in the other negative direction is unappealing to
Yes.
lenders. Yeah, well, that was understandable. But there are market forces that have impacts on earnings. Sometimes
Yes.
I imagine businesses are cyclical.
Yes, and I have sold businesses that weren't making any money. Well, you can do that if it's what we call a B2B business, let's say, a company selling to other businesses, and what they do have is a customer base. And so now you're selling the customer base to another company in the industry. They merge the business into theirs, probably eliminate a lot of duplicate expenses, and can make a profit where the seller was not making a profit.
Okay. So what are some other things that make a business more appealing and successful?
Well, one of the
to you?
things is that financial statements are accurate and they're consistent. That's something that buyers want to see, particularly as you get into bigger buyers. If you get into strategic buyers, private equity groups, they definitely want to see financial statements that are accurate, look consistent, because they're reporting to other people also. It's not just one individual who might be looking at that, and you can explain why it's not, everything doesn't look great. Another thing is that the revenues and expenses are on the books. A lot of times we talk to sellers, and it's funny how sellers who have money off the books think that everyone is doing it, but the fact is they're not. The vast majority of people that come to us are not. They have their money on the books, particularly when it's a better run company. And that it makes a business much more saleable. In fact, we usually take a pass on representing sellers who say, I've got a large amount of money off the books. It's just too difficult to sell, and it's also very difficult to get a bank to lend to the buyer to buy that type of business.
So can you describe what off the books means?
Well, when somebody's, I get paid, and somebody, not me literally, but somebody comes to us and says, I have a business, and everybody that comes in with cash, that goes into my pocket, and the checks and the credit cards go into the bank. Well, that's an example. Well, how much is it? Well, if it's $5,000, we forget about it perhaps, but if it's $100,000 or $200,000, that's a big deal.
That's significant.
It is, yes.
Yeah, so that doesn't show up in the financials because the off-the-books money doesn't show up in the financials. It makes the company's financials look differently.
Look worse because
less profitable.
Right, because they still have those expenses, but now they have $100,000 or $200,000 or whatever the number is, less in income. So it makes the business look much worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not that common.
Well, I don't think I wouldn't say it's uncommon, but it's not the vast majority of privately owned businesses, let's put it that way. I think it's a small minority.
Well, I think you have an interesting perspective on that, a good perspective on that, given who your clientele is.
The other thing I would say, just leaving financial statements, make a point is that we generally use tax returns as opposed to internal financial statements to look at how the business is doing. And that's what lenders definitely look at, and they'll still use add backs. In other words, if you've got a company car that's primarily used for personal use, you can probably add that back, and that'll be on the tax return. But the tax returns are considered the most legitimate statement by a small business, because most of these small businesses don't have reviewed or audited statements. They just give their accountant what they put together, and the accountant makes it look correct.
Yeah.
So that's generally what we look at in terms of financial. The tax returns.
They're the most reliable indication of the finances.
Are. Right.
Okay.
Another thing that it makes a business makes a business sell better is a recurring or repeating customer base, as opposed to what you would call projects. For example, construction companies, architects, those types of businesses are harder to sell because the income is not recurring, because sometimes, particularly with a construction company, a buyer will say, well, I'm buying a bunch of tools, but what am I getting beyond that? I've got to go out and make all the sales myself. And the most desirable ones are recurring or repeating revenue. And let me differentiate between that. Recurring is really almost like rent is on a real estate. Recurring would be, for example, if there's an IT company doing tech support for businesses, and they have managed services where people pay them based on the amount of computers they have, and they just write that check every month. That's a recurring revenue stream. A repeating one is where a company has a customer base that buys from them over and over. And so that's typical maybe of B2B businesses, a distribution company, a manufacturer that has regular customers, that type of thing.
That makes sense. I can understand that. But there are many kinds of service businesses where they're always looking for new projects, and they have a history of finding projects over a long period of time. So
Yes.
does that improve their eligibility for making them a good marketable company?
It does. People look at certainly the more ways they have of getting a regular revenue stream, the less it's dependent on the owner who's going to be leaving the business, the better.
So that's the key, because when the owner leaves, the likelihood of those projects coming in the future might change.
That's something to consider, right?
So the workflow may change because of the owner's relationships. The owner leaves and the relationships may not carry on to get more work. Is that the concern?
Right. So it's a good idea for an owner who's thinking that they're going to want to sell within the next few years to try to transition any real personal relationships to somebody else in the company.
Okay, so good financials, recurring revenue or repeating revenue.
Other things, I'm sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
are growth potential. People are buying a business and they pay for what a business has done, but they want to buy a business that they can grow. So the industry, it's very helpful to have an industry that's growing and to have have a business where a buyer can see opportunities to add revenues to the business.
Okay.
So that's another one. And along those same lines, or similar lines, I guess you could say barriers to entry. If it's easy for somebody to come in and become a competitor, that makes it less desirable, particularly today also with the internet. If somebody can easily do what you're doing on the internet, now there could be competition from anywhere in the world, anytime, and you wouldn't even know it's coming.
Right.
So that can hurt a business.
Right. So do you participate in putting the selling price on the business?
It depends. Sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. And that's when you get into question of who's the likely buyer. When you're dealing with individuals as being likely buyers, you like to put a price on it because individuals have a tougher time dealing with a situation where there isn't a price and there's no guidance. Whereas if you're dealing with larger companies, private equity groups, strategic buyers that have CFOs and financial people, they have their own model for what they're willing to offer. And so by putting a price on a business, then what you've done is put a cap on it. And so the feeling is, that offer it without a price. And so right now we have some that we have on the market without a price and some with a price. And it's more typical that we'll have it without a price if we think it's going to be bought by a strategic buyer, and if the business is generating maybe $500,000 to $1 million in owner income or more.
Oh, so that's interesting. So you have some listings of clients, of selling businesses that don't have a price on them.
Yes.
That'll be dictated by the market and potential buyers.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about the kind of businesses that you think will be bought by individual buyers and where you do put a price on. How do you calculate the price, the seller price?
Well, we're typically looking at the market, what businesses like that sell for.
Yeah.
We also do look at the income approach some, but we primarily use the market approach. And we also have access to third-party appraisers. And if somebody wants to pay for a valuation, more for a valuation, and have one from an accredited appraiser, we work with them. We put together the information, and they crunch the numbers.
Yeah. Is the emphasis on the value of the business really on how much the potential owner could earn?
Yes. It's more, though, on what the business has done in the past. We're not forecasting for a couple reasons. One is that we don't want to get into a situation where a buyer says, well, you said it was going to do X in 3 years, and it's not. So we don't want to do that. So we're looking primarily at how the business has done in the past, and that's primarily what a buyer is looking at. Now, where we can get into disagreements, is, well, do you look at the last year because that's how closest to what the business is doing, or A buyer might argue that's been a great year, but that's not going to be typical, and I want to look at 3 years, that type of thing.
And potentially average the 3 years.
It's right.
Or use the buyer might focus on the lowest number of the 3
Exactly.
years and the seller on the highest, right?
Right.
Right. Well, I imagine to an individual buyer, the earnings, the salary, and the other benefits that inure to that potential buyer are important. How much a person could earn.
Absolutely.
Themselves.
And usually when we're working with people, we are trying to find out those sort of numbers, and people don't always think about it and think about adding on to, let's say somebody wants to make $200,000 a year to live on. Well, they need to add on to that something to pay off the loan they're going to need to buy the business. So we might be looking for a business that's throwing off $300,000 so that they have that.
Right. And of course, the relationship between the earnings to the owner and the revenue to the company vary depending on what kind of business it is, what the revenues
Yes.
are and what the expenses are.
Right, and also what the owner does in the business. Sometimes another factor, depending on the buyer, in particular if you're dealing with, let's say, a larger buyer, we haven't talked about other things about the business, but one is the people situation. So it's not unusual particularly when you have somebody who is retiring, for example, that a lot of the other people in the company are the same age. They've been in the business for a long time.
Yeah.
That can make it very difficult if a buyer comes in and says, I've got to replace 6 people, I can't do that. Or if there are lots of family members, same situation. The buyer looks at it, there's too many people here that are in the family that very well might leave. Another factor that we didn't talk about but makes a difference is equipment. If the two companies could be in the same industry making exactly the same amount of money, but if one has all new up-to-date equipment and the other one has all outdated equipment, they're going to sell for a very different price.
Mm-hmm. So the human capital issue is interesting and selling, especially related to selling a family business, where apparently one of the family members is not that interested in buying, and they may all leave if the seller leaves.
Right. So it's a factor that, yes.
That moving target. Very interesting. And what about in kind of internal procedures for companies? How important are those?
Well, it's
manuals.
It's very helpful if a company has their internal procedures documented. I've only had, unfortunately, a few that have done that to the degree that somebody could just walk in, pick up the book, and just look, this is how something is done. It's terrific. It also is one reason that franchises are very popular with people, because that's typically what a franchise is done. And we do resell franchises. But they'll have all their procedures documented, and they of course have a very formal training program, and people like that. And it works also with companies. If you have all your procedures documented, so if somebody leaves, you know exactly what to do. For somebody else can just refer to the book and know what they're supposed to be doing.
Step right in and rely on the operating procedures.
Right.
Getting back to kind of something we talked about earlier about the time frame, do you think the optimal time frame to get this process started to sell a business?
Well, we usually ask for a year, not because it usually takes a year, but the average time it takes to sell a business from the time that a business broker might list that business till when it's sold is 6 to 9 months, and that's typical. And what will make a big difference is also the price. Like anything else, if you're asking too high a price, nothing will happen. And it's a good indication to us that it's overly priced. I had one recently, which was primarily real estate, but we had it on the market for $1 million without any appraisal behind it. And I had the seller, I said, you got to get an appraisal so we don't waste our time, having a deal at $1 million and then it appraises at $500,000, and now,
Sure.
we don't have a deal anymore.
Yeah.
And he did that, and he got an appraisal at a little over $600,000 for the real estate. We lowered the price to that figure. We quickly had a lot of buyers interested, and we have it under agreement now.
All right, and prior to the listing of the business, how much lead time do you think a business needs to kind of get its house in order to make it most marketable?
Well, it depends on the business, and it depends how marketable it's been beforehand.
Yeah.
Some businesses are really on top of all these things, and it doesn't take a lot. And then others are not, and it takes a long time for them to get everything together. So It's hard to answer that question.
Yeah, all right. Some come to you in better shape than others, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So let's talk about what makes it hard to sell a business. Can you identify some things that make it really difficult to sell?
Well, one thing I would say along those lines, is that makes it harder to sell is what a business looks like. I always like to want to meet with the owner at the business to see what it looks like. And I've had a few cases where I've walked in, I don't care what the numbers look like, the place looks like a disaster. And there's no way that, I want to try and sell it because it has such
bad curb appeal, huh?
Exactly, very poor curb appeal.
Uh-huh.
And I think a lot of times that how it looks is probably how, it's being run too.
Probably some indication.
Yeah.
So Mark, what can you do as a business broker to maximize a sale?
Well, I think that the primary thing that we end up doing is trying to find the most and the best buyers. And by doing that, you should get more offers at a higher price. And there are a couple different types of sales I've talked about. One is, let's say, to an individual where a lot of our marketing is internet-based marketing. And even though, everybody's got a website, it doesn't mean everybody has the same number of people coming to their website or that they're marketing on internet websites in the same way, or they're co-broking. I was one of the founders of a co-broke group that are, 13 agencies in New England are in, but many are not.
So you're sharing inventory, essentially.
Exactly, just like the real estate agents do. All these things bring in more buyers and lead to, we feel, better offers and higher offers. And another thing, which is a related type of sale, is, let's say, to a strategic buyer. So now we're looking for companies primarily that might be buyers for the business. And we will identify those. We will get names from the seller who knows his industry. And we will put together a list of companies that we are contacting. I have one right now on the market, and we reached out to about 300 companies in the industry to try to find a buyer.
Uh-huh.
But in addition, we do our internet marketing, still keeping the business confidential because today it reaches companies all over the world. And if we're talking about, we're selling companies that are still relatively small, let's say the most they may sell for $5 or $10 million, that's a small company, and you can't identify all the potential buyers, particularly if it's maybe in California or overseas where we've had some sales. So those buyers, though, may very well be looking on the internet for a business to buy. So by combining that, reaching out to targeted and identified buyers and internet, it maximizes the number of buyers, the best buy. Hopefully we reach the best buyers also. So that I refer to the marketing. And another thing that goes along with that is putting together for qualified buyers and a good presentation on the business that's being sold, and not just handing them a bunch of documents and saying, figure it out.
Uh-huh.
So we do that with all the businesses we're selling, no matter whether it's to an individual or to a strategic buyer.
Uh-huh.
Those are the things that, anyway, a broker can do to better the sale.
I imagine your presentation materials are very important to give your client good exposure, not just maximize exposure, but also make it look like a quality company.
Right. Another important thing that's done in there is to show the seller's discretionary earnings we talked about. So somebody doesn't look at the bottom line of a business and it made $10,000 last year, and they don't add in the $150,000 salary and the cars and the retirement plan and all the other perks that might be legitimate taken out of the business, and it's much more. So we show that so people
make sure
are
they understand
getting correct information. Exactly.
Or know how to interpret the documents.
Right. And also same way on giving them information on the customer base, that they know that the customer base is not dependent on one big customer, and that's a stable customer base. And a lot of things like that would be of interest to a buyer and affect the sale.
So does your office at BayState Business Brokers do the write-up on your sellers to include in the presentation?
We both. A lot of times we have some outside writers that we use to do the preliminary draft, and then we will take that and edit it and then give it to the owners to review and approve.
I see.
We don't use anything without their approval.
That presentation must be very important.
It is. I've had a number of buyers who have said to us that exactly that, and have said how much better it is than some other ones that they've gotten from other business brokers on businesses.
Uh-huh. That's the added value you bring to your clients as sellers.
Yes.
What do you recommend to buyers, I suppose, from a buying point of view? Any suggestions about how to look at a business?
Sure. I think a few things. One is to only buy businesses with money on the books. I mean, even I've got a lot of experience, and even if I were buying a business, I want to see the money on the books.
Yeah.
I'm not, okay, so that's number one. Number two, I would say is go out and get involved in the process. One thing you really see from experienced buyers, and they're typically in a particular industry, is they can move quickly because they know the industry, they've seen a lot of businesses in the industry, and when they see the right business, they know they want to get that business.
They can make a decision.
They can make a decision quickly.
Okay.
I've had a private equity group make a decision they signed the confidentiality agreement on a Wednesday. A week from that Friday, they had signed the letter of intent.
No
That's
kidding.
how quickly they moved. By the Wednesday, they signed the NDA. Friday, they had a phone conference. Monday, they met face to face, and the rest of the week was putting together a letter of intent. I've had other buyers do it in one day. When they're very experienced with that industry. Now, I'm not saying everybody should do that, but certainly if it's a good business, you want to be able to, and it's priced right, you want to be able to move quickly on that and not expect that, well, if it takes me a month to evaluate everything, it'll still be around. It really won't be. There are a lot of buyers out there, and there are a lot of buyers that are qualified and have money and are motivated.
So timing is important.
Yes.
And decisiveness. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. So do you think that manufacturing businesses are easier to sell than service businesses? Something with equipment and hardware as opposed to a service business, an architectural firm like you mentioned before, for example?
It depends what they're in. I mean, because service businesses could be doing a lot of things. I mentioned an IT company that does internet technology service. Those are very desirable. On the other hand, I also use the illustration, let's say, of an architect, not to say that they're, bad businesses, but harder to sell because they're project-based.
Yeah.
And manufacturing businesses are generally desirable, although if you get into some types of manufacturing, for example, let's say a machine shop, it's a very limited market, and you probably have to find a strategic buyer for that or an industry buyer for a machine shop. There aren't too many. What most individuals are looking for are businesses that they can easily learn and manage. So, for example, a commercial cleaning business would be a lot easier to sell because even if somebody doesn't have that background, they certainly feel like they can learn it.
Yeah.
And a bank would lend to them if they had some business experience and management experience.
And maybe repeat customers.
Yeah, and they have repeat customers, exactly, recurring customers even. Yes.
Yes, I saw from your great website that you had a list of companies sold, and I was fascinated by the list and the variety. Liquor stores, pet stores, fitness centers, personal training franchises, children's entertainment and recreation center.
Yes.
It's great. It's really must be very interesting work you do.
It is. It's interesting also sometimes to see, as a former business owner, how people manage their businesses and how successful people manage their business and really make a success out of it.
Well, I appreciate your coming in today for a podcast and listening to what you have to say about maximizing the sale of a business and looking at things that are obstacles, such as divorces, and on making a profitable sale. And thanks a lot, Mark. Nice to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like more information about the topics covered in our podcast, please contact us at Grossman & Associates. You'll find a competent and experienced team of compassionate, responsive, and innovative legal professionals. Email me at hindell@grossmanltd.com. My first name is spelled Hindell, or call us at 617-969-0069. Thank you for listening.